Hello and welcome. I'm Mary Kay Magistad, the Associate Director of Asia Society's Center on U.S. China Relations and a former Beijing-based China correspondent for U.S. Public Radio. And we're here today to talk about a big meeting held this week in Beijing by China's top leaders and why it matters to China's future direction domestically and globally, to leadership stability, and to the degree of power held by China's top leader, its president, and more importantly, General Secretary of the Communist Party, Xi Jinping. The big meeting was, of course, the 6th Plenum of the 19th Central Committee, with more than 370 members and alternates gathering. Plenums are a usual thing in Chinese governance. There are usually 7 of them in a 5-year Central Committee term. And at them, party leaders can make big policy announcements and lay the groundwork for new laws. A couple of times before in history, the 6th Plenum, which this one was, focuses on ideology and strengthening the party, led to a re-examination and a reframing of history by Mao Zedong in 1945, consolidating his power, and by Deng Xiaoping in 1981, criticizing Mao's excesses in the Cultural Revolution. Well, now there's another reframing, a historical resolution as it's called, that reframes Xi Jinping, Mao as a great leader, and Xi as his worthy successor, and others who came in between as contributing to the transition when they weren't screwing up or going in the wrong direction and letting pernicious Western ideas and influences seep into China. So, meanwhile, state-run media have been heaping accolades on Xi and even calling him the helmsman and the people's leader, which only Mao was called up until this point, and saying basically to love China is to love the Communist Party, is to love Xi Jinping, that all of these things are inseparable. Since Xi has engineered an end to term limits as top leader, he may now stay in power indefinitely, or at least signs suggest that at next year's party Congress, he'll get a 3rd term. So why does all this matter? What does it tell us about how much Xi Jinping has consolidated his power and what he could do with it now? And how might that affect how Xi and China's Communist Party govern at home and project power abroad? Here to help us think about all this is Asia Society's president and CEO, Kevin Rudd, who also leads the Asia Society's Policy Institute. He was Australia's prime minister twice and foreign minister in between. He's a Chinese-speaking China scholar who served as an Australian diplomat in Beijing before running for office, and he's now a leading international analyst on China. Also with us is Christopher Johnson, a senior fellow at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, D.C. He spent almost 2 decades in the U.S. government's intelligence and foreign affairs communities, including as senior China analyst for the CIA. Kevin and Chris will each speak for about 10 minutes. We'll have a conversation, and then we'll take written questions from you. Feel free to send them in anytime during the session. Kevin, over to you.
Thank you very much, Mary Kay. And it's great to be here also with my friend, Chris Johnson, who is a formidable analyst of Chinese domestic politics. Mary Kay, at the outset, you indicated why party plenums are important and why this one may be particularly important. Of course, it's the annual event in Chinese party politics. And in any normal plenum, it defines the parameters for acceptable discourse on ideology, acceptable discourse on politics, acceptable discourse on public policy. But on this one in particular, it's got a couple of significances in addition. Of course, it comes 12 months out from the 20th Party Congress, which, as you've indicated, leads us to the question of Xi Jinping's re-elect, or I would say reappoint, and likely, if he is reappointed, which I believe he will, to remain effectively leader for life, in my judgment. But beyond that, this particular party plenum, the 6th Plenum of the 19th Central Committee, is, as you've also indicated, a plenum which has produced a resolution on party history. And these occur rarely in the overall 100-year history of the Chinese Communist Party. As you said before, 1945, when Mao used that plenum to produce a resolution on party history, which brought to a close that period effectively from the Zunyi Conference in the mid-30s through the Yan'an rectification movement and on to 1945, where Mao used the resolution on history to ideologically entrench his dominance of the party and his dominance of the party politically against those who had challenged it over the previous 8 or 9 years. Then secondly, the 1981 resolution follows a similar pattern in this sense. Following the death of Mao himself, Deng used the 1981 resolution on party history to entrench his own position as the paramount leader, still within the framework of a collective leadership where senior leaders such as Chen Yun were also present, but nonetheless to place in context, therefore, Mao's contribution to China, both the positive contribution and the negative contribution, including Mao's errors in the period after 1956, particularly the anti-rightist movement, particularly the Great Leap Forward, and particularly the Cultural Revolution. So that brings us to this resolution, only the third in 100 years. Our handicap, of course, with this resolution in having this discussion today is we have not yet seen the full and final text of it. We're relying instead on a summary of it contained in the communique of the plenum itself. But if you put together what the communique says about the resolution and the press conference convened in the last 24 hours by the propaganda department on what the resolution means, I think we've got enough at least to form our analysis around. But the caveat is, once the full text is revealed, I'm sure there's going to be greater nuance that I certainly will be able to reflect this evening. So, 4 or 5 reflections on what we've seen so far. Number one, I think, is this. Xi Jinping, in my judgment, is a master Machiavellian politician. He knows where most of the bodies are buried in Chinese domestic politics. He has observed it as someone within the, as it were, central court of Chinese politics, as a princeling himself. And therefore, unlike many of the other practitioners we've seen up against him, he displays an extraordinary political statecraft in obtaining, securing and sustaining political power. And so the particular utility to which he has put this resolution on party history at this 6th Plenum of the 19th Central Committee seems to be, in a nutshell, this: to so elevate his own position as the core leader of the Chinese Communist Party for the new era. And secondly, in parallel to that, to elevate and entrench the status of Xi Jinping Thought, that he places both those beyond reproach, criticism, let alone or attack, between now and the critical 20th Party Congress itself, to be held at the end of next year, thereby smoothing the way for him to be reappointed for the period following that. Of course, it has a further benefit as well. Following his reappointment, the status which he then has achieved within the Chinese political pantheon, both as a leader and with an eponymous thought system around him, Xi Jinping Thought, is that in the years following the 2022 Party Congress, he also remains effectively untouchable in terms of criticism of him. Because to criticize Xi Jinping, now that we have this resolution on party history, or to criticize Xi Jinping Thought, will now be tantamount to criticizing the party itself and, frankly, criticizing the country. So the sheer Machiavellian craft in elevating yourself and elevating your body of thought to this unprecedented status prior to the 20th Party Congress, which decides whether you become leader for life, effectively insulates you against much, albeit not all, the criticism which would come your way. To advance such a criticism with this resolution having been passed would become very hazardous indeed. A few further reflections. Firstly, on the question of party history itself. As we know, all good historical materialists love periodization. In fact, they've got what I describe as a periodization fetish. everything has to be periodized, because if you're an historical determinist, that's how it works when you're all on, as it were, the road to producing the promised land of socialism on the one hand, and of course, China's great national rejuvenation, whereby China becomes the greatest power in the world again on the other. But in this periodization, we now have further and final confirmation of the three-part periodization. The Mao period, when China, of course, stood up, 中国站起来, kicked out the foreigners, united the country. Number two, we have Deng Xiaoping, his period being when China became prosperous from 78 through until the advent of Xi Jinping, 中国富起来. And now the third period, once again, stated in clear and clarion terms, when China now becomes strong, and that is ultimately the strongest country on earth, 中国强起来. And so the symmetry of this three-part periodization is now clear through this resolution on party history. This, however, is not just an exercise in intellectual elegance and neatness. The key ideological function here is because you have different periods of China's evolution, it means, therefore, there must be different ideological tools, policy tools, leadership tools necessary to execute the new tasks of this new era. Of course, as a footnote to that, Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao become mere coders at the end of the Deng Xiaoping period rather than freestanding leadership periods in their own rights. On the question of the leadership, what is interesting about this communique description of the resolution is not simply its description of Xi Jinping as the core leader. We've had that now effectively for the last several years. What is interesting is the new phrase which is added to describe Xi Jinping as the core leader, is that this is now the universal view on the part of the party, the army, the Jun, as well as the Renmin, the people itself, and it now has decisive significance. 决定性的意义. That's a new phrase. And therefore, once again, his core leadership function has been elevated to a new level, thereby rendering him even more invulnerable to attack and critique from his colleagues in the lead up to the 20th Congress and beyond. Third point I'd make is about ideology itself. It's quite fascinating, the study of Marxism-Leninism under Xi Jinping. I've done a lot of work on this in recent years. And Xi Jinping's exposition of Marxism, frankly, is more comprehensive, consistent, and intense than, frankly, all previous Chinese political leaders, including Mao Zedong himself. If you look at Xi Jinping's works on dialectical materialism, on historical materialism, and on Marx himself, it's quite a formidable oeuvre. But the phrase used in this resolution, as reported by the communique, about Xi Jinping Thought now representing the contemporary embodiment of Marxism for the 21st century, that is significant. It's again an elevation of where we were before, with Xi Jinping being one of a number of continuing contributors to the evolution of socialism with Chinese characteristics and the incremental sinification of Chinese Marxism, which has been underway really for the last several decades. But when you start to say that this is now the Marxism of the 20th century and must therefore provide the guiding role for the party, this is intent in a further elevation of Xi Jinping's status. Second last point. Beyond ideology itself, of course, there is policy. And I always see ideology, to use a phrase employed originally, I think, by Kerry Brown, the British sinologist, is that ideology constitutes a band of meaning. But within that band of broad meaning, you then see directions for policy. And when I looked at the way in which Xi Jinping policy has emerged over the last 9 years, my haiku summary of it, to mix our Japanese and Chinese analogies, is that Xi Jinping's politics, or the politics of China, has moved to the left under Xi Jinping, which means more power for the party against the professional apparatus of the state, more power for Xi Jinping, the individual, over the collective leadership of the party, and certainly more power for the party and the leader in relation to other centres in Chinese society, like the academy, like arts, like non-government organisations, like religion, and ethnic minorities. But there's also been a parallel move to the left on the economy. State-owned enterprises over the private sector, planning over the market, in addition to the new redistributionist agenda that we see alive within the common prosperity agenda, and a resuscitation with greater vigour of doctrines, earlier doctrines of national self-reliance, Zili Gengsheng, all suggesting a correction on where the market exuberance lay in previous periods of China's economic leadership, particularly in the period of Jiang Zemin and to a lesser extent under Hu Jintao. Nonetheless, despite these policy orientations towards the left, as I define it, both in politics and the political economy, the elasticity which Xi Jinping Thought provides Xi Jinping and the rest of the structure around him is that it can be bent one way or the other within this band of meaning, depending on the political circumstances of the time. But because Xi Jinping Thought has now been elevated to this new status within the political pantheon and given its treatment by this historical resolution, it also means that whenever it is applied in the future to a new policy initiative, by definition, therefore, it is orthodox, it is legitimate, its 合法性 cannot be challenged. So much on policy. The very final point is about China's view of the world and how that changes or maybe doesn't change a whole lot based on this particular resolution. I'll be interested to hear Chris's reflections on this. But if we look at the communique's discussion of the language concerning China's place in the world, it brings together the thematics that we've seen over now a considerable period of time. But it makes the case in more strident terms than before. The language, for example, concerning the efficacy of the Chinese development model for the developing world, as opposed to the liberal capitalist alternative, is in fact sharper and starker than we've seen, for example, in the 19th Party Congress. Furthermore, the critique contained in the propaganda department's exposition of the communique today, when they referred to the problems of the American model and the erosion of public opinion support for that model within the United States, as opposed to international survey data supporting the Chinese population's enthusiasm for China's own development model, is all part of a wider narrative that China now has an ability to disrupt world history with an entirely new model. And wrapped within that, of course, is Xi Jinping's concept of a community of common destiny for all humankind. I'll leave my remarks there, Mary Kay. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Kevin. And Chris, over to you.
Great, thank you. Thank you for the opportunity, both Kevin and Mary Kay. Great to be here and to share the stage with Kevin as always. Yeah, I would just add a few things to Kevin's commentary. For me, I think I've always been someone who has been wary of the perils of over-reliance on textual analysis. I think it can lead people into a lot of danger in that, sometimes there's a philosophy of, well, if it's not in Xinhua or People's Daily, then it's not real. And we don't have things like politics and so on. But as Kevin highlighted, given how rare these documents are, this is only the third one in 100 years, this one, I think it's worth paying attention to the textual analysis and what the document tells us. And more importantly, in some cases, what it doesn't tell us. As Kevin said, we don't have the full text yet. But, and obviously the synopsis and the communique only serves as a sort of foreshadow to what will be in the proper document. But I think the major pieces are there, as Kevin highlighted, and what wasn't there, the propaganda rollout and so on, has kind of told us where to look. So this really is one of those few times where, the number of paragraphs, the length of the paragraphs, the positioning, the description, all is done very thoughtfully. And we'll come back to it. We'll just put a pin in that for the moment and come back. But I want to start off to kind of further pick up on a few of the things that Kevin said about what this means for Xi Jinping and why is he doing it? And I think, really this document in my mind in this plenum helped provide some important answers, or at least clues, to the question that's on everyone's mind, which is, what does Xi Jinping want? Why is he doing things like the crackdown on the internet sector, the crackdown on the property sector? What is common prosperity? Where does he want to go with these things, and so on? Why is he doing what he's doing? And my sense is this document gives us some pretty good clues on that. And in my assessment, there's basically three things that Xi Jinping wants out of this process and where he would like to go. The first is that, as powerful as he is, as Kevin just elucidated, even he needs a justification to be able to stay around for another term, and perhaps longer, as Kevin suggested. As it was put to me by someone recently, even Mao needed to, A, do the history resolution for the reason that Kevin highlighted about consolidating his own position early on in the party, but B, had to launch the Cultural Revolution, even someone of his standing, to regain control of the party. So you need a justification. The second piece in my mind is that Xi has become completely obsessed with the importance of having the country break through the middle income trap by 2035. And I think, therefore, the need to reassess history, as many analysts pointed out in covering this document, it's not really about history. It's about what happens from here forward, and using history as a justification to make the critical turn, if you will, that you want to in terms of policy. And as Kevin highlighted, the linkage between ideology and policy here is very clear. The third piece, I think, which really was highlighted in the press conference that Kevin discussed today, was this whole issue of how this all fits into what Xi Jinping might call a global narrative context with the US, but with the broader West in general, about, in a way, who has the better system. And so we see a lot of emphasis of recently, for example, about whole process democracy. We had, for the first time ever, a work conference on people's congresses and the system there. These things don't just happen by accident. And I think Xi has a very strong feeling that if we can be seen globally as doing better than the US and the West on income inequality, on the disparities in society, on giving people a better life, as they like to say, this will pay tremendous dividends for us in this global narrative contest with the US and the West. So I think those are Xi's primary justifications. I'd also like to spend a few minutes talking about the context for Xi Jinping and how he thinks about his political position and trying to unpack this. I agree with Kevin. I think arguably Xi has had many political achievements during his tenure, but I would say that his signal one, perhaps, or his signature one, has been very early on in his tenure. And again, I think this was prompted by the kind of immersion that Kevin highlighted it from a young man in the party's history and how to run the party, is this idea of breaking the history into these three epochs. He did it almost immediately upon coming to power. And as Kevin highlighted, we've got the Mao era, the Deng era, those two guys we don't talk about anymore, and the now Xi Jinping's new era. And this is important, of course, because it then set the stage for him to be able to further codify that at the 19th Party Congress with the advocation of Xi Jinping Thought, for horribly long name, which he hopes to eventually truncate into just Xi Jinping Thought, probably at the next Party Congress. And as Kevin suggested, what that does, of course, is it serves to legitimize and codify the sum total of all of his pronouncements, all of his actions, and the policy decisions that he's made into this sort of unassailable position within the party. And that's very, very important because, as Kevin highlighted, it's now a very dangerous game to criticize either Xi himself or his policies. And that doesn't mean that he can't be criticized, though. And we might come back to that as well in our Q&A as to, is there anything in this where he sees a vulnerability and therefore he feels he's got to further fortify the ship, if you will, in that regard. So I think that's fundamental. And so when we take the sum total of that, the way I like to characterize it is, this isn't about, as we often see in media takes and so on, Xi's consolidation of power. In my mind, this is the evolution of the further articulation of his leadership supremacy. And I think that's a very important distinction to make. And in my mind, he consolidated power roughly in 2014, or maybe 15 at the latest. very, very quick blitzkrieg approach to consolidating power. And that's important for foreign governments, for foreign analysts to understand, because if you're not so busy consolidating power, then you're busy making policies that stick, that matter, that we should all presume will be around for a good long time. And therefore, if you're trying to craft a China policy, whether you're a US policymaker, an Australian policymaker, or anyone else, your core assumptions should be that this guy's going to be around for a while. The policies that are articulated aren't going to change fundamentally, and we should guide ourselves accordingly. And also, I think, based on the kind of celebratory atmosphere of the history resolution, that our core assumption should be that we should assume they're more likely to succeed than fail on a lot of what they're doing, even if success is 40% successful, 30% successful, however you want to define that. And I think that's another really important aspect here. And then I just want to spend a few minutes, because I think it's related. There was a lot of discussion, I think, when the Politburo released the title of this new resolution, and people rightly noticed, well, there's nothing in here about certain issues or certain questions in the party history, which of course was in the title of the two previous ones, which was used as code for criticism of Mao's enemies, as Kevin highlighted in the first resolution, and the errors or the extravagances of the Mao period in the 81 resolution. So I think a lot of people thought, okay, including Chinese analysts that were interviewed in the Chinese press, well, this is going to be just very celebratory and forward-looking and so on, and we can't have any criticism because that suggests maybe there are divisions and all that. I think if we look at the document carefully, there's a fair amount of criticism in there, and I think it's particularly directed to some degree at kind of knocking Deng down a peg. There is an interesting omission in the communique, and obviously, again, we're going to have to get the full resolution to see what the story is here. But, as Kevin highlighted, we talk about Mao Zedong thought as the first leap in the sinicization of Marxism. A lot of previous party propaganda, especially in the run-up to the July 100th anniversary, highlighted Deng Xiaoping's theory as the second leap in the sinicization of Marxism. This document did not do that. In fact, it didn't say that Deng Xiaoping theory was a leap at all. And the leap that then is described is sort of seemingly a consolidation of Deng Jianghu. So whereas Deng previously was given separate treatment, it seems like they're increasingly amalgamating him into that Jianghu period that we don't want to talk about anymore. So it'll be very interesting to see when we get to full text what the Deng section looks like. But I think the harshest criticism really is for the Jiang and Hu period. Again, it's elliptical, but as the kids would say, I think it's hashtag subtle, not subtle, in that it discusses, as Mary Kay highlighted at the top of the discussion, a series of failings during that period, that the party governance was loose, that supervision was not strict enough, that corruption was a problem, and so on and so forth. And I think, again, contextually, this is very important, because what did Xi Jinping think he was inheriting when he first took power? My argument is that he largely, arguably, saw that period around 2012 as the maximum point of danger that the party had faced, certainly since Tiananmen, perhaps in its history. And what was going on in that context? If you're a guy like Xi Jinping and you've been steeped in how to control the party, and you're looking at the way the key levers of power inside the party are operating, your top two figures in your military, which is not the national military of China, but the armed wing of the Chinese Communist Party that keeps it in power, are corrupt and perhaps not loyal. The security services under Zhou Yongkang are behaving rather loosely, perhaps against your own accession to power. We have the party's general office in Ling Jihua manipulating straw polls for the next leadership, so on and so forth. This is scary stuff, if you're Xi Jinping. And so it created in his mind, I think, the need for decisive action. And of course, the justification then by creating this sort of sense of urgency, if you will, or crisis, to be able to do what he's done in terms of the consolidation of power, getting rid of term limits, getting rid of collective leadership, so on and so forth. So why don't I stop there, and we'll get into the big discussion. Thank you.
Thanks, Chris. So this is a question for both of you. How much is the Chinese public buying this? The idea that Xi is the party is the country, you can't criticize anyone without basically being disloyal. I mean, under Mao, I think there was genuine emotional attachment to him as a leader. But this is a more educated, better informed, more skeptical public than the Chinese public was under Mao. So, I mean, to what extent do we know what the Chinese public actually thinks, given that like any public opinion poll that's done now is going to be subject to people self-censoring or being careful what they say? Because there's a real concern that like you could be punished if you say the wrong thing. Chris, I see you nodding. Do you want to go first?
Sure. No, I think that's right. It's sort of like, do you like Xi Jinping, right? So it's difficult for people to be able to answer these things honestly. But I think we put ourselves in danger if we assume that they just tune it all out and they're sort of skeptical and jaded and so on. I think what Kevin articulated, which is the new epic of strong China, right? Powerful China. This does resonate a lot, I think, with the local public. And I think it's also really, really important that we not underestimate the power that their information shaping machine has on people inside China. Yes, the elites can get access to very difficult through VPNs and so on to other outside information, but most Chinese cannot. And when this is bombarded at you time and again, take for example, COVID, right? How many things were written saying this is China's Chernobyl moment, they're done, and so on and so forth. If anything, they've come out stronger with stronger public legitimacy from it. Now, if they continue to maintain the COVID zero policy and so on, well, maybe people are going to be less convinced. But my point is that I think it's often at our peril when we underestimate how influential this can be. And my sense is he does have genuine, relatively strong support for what he's doing.
Kevin, what about you? So these are a couple of generations of Chinese, the younger generations that grew up under reform and opening up. Do you think that they will wholeheartedly embrace this new era of Xi Jinping thought going forward?
Of course not, because it's a fairly diverse set of views, particularly amid, let's call it Chinese political elites, whether they happen to be within the party or outside the formal framework of the party. The second point, though, is I think the political intentionality on Xi Jinping's part and Wang Huning's part, the propaganda czar within the Chinese system, with this resolution on party history that we've been discussing in this seminar, has been to make it impossible, or as impossible as possible, for there to be valid criticism of Xi Jinping or Xi Jinping thought by party members themselves, let alone those in senior positions, because you're then beginning to assault the actual nature and institution of both the party and even the country. For broader public opinion, which is the actual thrust, I think, of your question, Mary Kay, I think it's as diverse as it's always been. But I think there is an evolution underway. And as none of us have a social science discipline here, and a series of empirical tools to establish, as you know, what Chinese social attitudes are today about X, Y, and Z, A, B, and C, particularly about politics. And we've got to treat with a grain of skepticism and a grain of salt claims one way or the other, that they all hate Xi Jinping or they all love Xi Jinping. But I always take, as a former politician myself, a view that political leaders do not throw a whole bunch of cash and resources and talent at a propaganda apparatus if they think it's useless. These guys and the increased sophistication of China's propaganda apparatus beyond the clunky kind of apparatchiks that we've seen in previous decades, compared with the slicker, more sophisticated forms of social attitude massage, which now occur through the political apparatus, clunkiness still continuing, I think has more potential to be effective than what we've seen with previous incarnations. The second point I'd make, beyond, as it were, the mechanistic nature of the tools of the trade, is this, and that is, and Chris made an excellent point about this just before, the magnetic impact of nationalism and national achievement. And the Changqilai agenda hasn't been chosen for fun. It hasn't been chosen for its inherent semantic symmetry. It's been chosen because it resonates. And remember, the two elements of China's ultimate ideological worldview under the Communist Party is both Marxism, Leninism, and nationalism. And so if the Marxist-Leninism, as it were, pillar of the political legitimacy tent begins to fail and flail either through economic non-performance or excessive repression, you've always got the nationalist pillar to pump up. And when you've got this aggregation of Olympic events, moon landings, China doing well at this, that, and the other, becoming the second largest economy, the second largest equities market, the second largest whatever, and the largest this and the largest that. The fact that the propaganda machinery runs this with such intensity, again, I conclude is not because they're engaged in a wild experiment. They know that this stuff works, just like nationalism works in other political cultures as well.
And I would just add real quickly on top of that, let's not underestimate the value they're gaining from the poor performance of the West.
Right. Well, so she is getting credit for all kinds of things in the publicity that's been coming out around the plenum, for making China stronger, for lifting many Chinese out of poverty, for all kinds of other things. But I mean, to what extent do you think he deserves the credit he's getting? And how much do you think he's drawing on what those who he no longer wants to name did before him, what the era of reform and opening up did before him? How much is he actually delivering for Chinese people in ways that matter to them in this era when economic growth is slowing, the population is aging, the workforce is shrinking? I mean, how is he doing in his approach at the moment? Who wants to go first?
I'll take a stab at it. My sense is obviously he has inherited a lot, right? Certainly the policies of reform and opening, the strong growth, all the things that we see talked about. There was an interesting article the other day, I think it was in Bloomberg, about, what if he's just incompetent? In other words, and that he's just gotten lucky, right? And that in fact what he's doing is crashing the country, through his policies and so on. This is my sense of it. I think for now, it's hard to say necessarily what he's delivering. What he certainly delivered is a country that is now taken very seriously internationally, for good or for ill. And if that is the sense of, the toothier foreign policy, wolf warriorism, whatever you want to call it, that we've seen over the last several years, or if it's now this economic agenda, what I think he's delivering to the people is that he is basically saying it's time in this evolution in our, chase after strong China that we make some very big bets. I think that more aggressive foreign policy approach is a big bet. And I think that the common prosperity agenda is the domestic economic equivalent of what we've seen with the foreign policy shift. And that is this, that increasingly the results are binary. He's either going to find a way to succeed or he's going to crash the plane in various aspects. And so in terms of, how well or not he's delivering, I think, we still have an open book, but he's trying to head in that direction. It's precisely the demographic things and so on that you highlight. This is the sense of urgency. We just saw the other day, population may already be declining, not 2-3 years from now, it might be happening already now. This is why we see, I think, this embrace in the recent Politburo study session of the digital economy. We've got to leave the old dirty investment-led economy behind. That includes the property sector and so on, because if we don't, to what I said earlier, we won't break through the middle income trap. And then I also think it's foolish to sort of suggest that he's just picking up on the seeds that Hu Jintao and others left him. That's not true. He's fundamentally rewired the way that system works. He's created all these new leading groups. He's created certainly a re-emphasis on the party and its control, north, south, east, west, the party controls it all. These sort of things, these are significant differences from his predecessors, and I don't think necessarily represent a natural evolution. Whether or not that's serving the interests of the Chinese people, that's another question.
Yeah.
I think if you're a committed Leninist, Mary Kay, you'd give the guy 9 out of 10. Because this wobbly, rickety structure of the party that he inherited, corrupt to the core, and being marginalized on central questions of economic policy, If you're a Leninist, and I'm not, by the way, if you're a Leninist, you would rank the guy fairly highly. If, however, you are a classical economist and you're animated by core propositions that economic growth underpins everything, and economic growth is sustained by three propositions: population, workforce participation, productivity, or as our American cousins say, productivity. The bottom line is this: all three of those are in trouble. And on productivity growth, the single worst thing you can do is to create trouble and tumult for the Chinese private sector on multiple fronts simultaneously, whether it's anti-monopoly law, whether it's wealth redistribution, whether it's party committees in your firms, whether it's the mixed economy model, whereby SOEs are, as it were, invited to take some equity in your private firm when it's successful, and your private firm is invited to take equity in an SOE which is failing. If you are sitting there as a chief executive of a private firm which you built up from scratch 25 years ago, I reckon your animal spirits will be feeling a little less animalistic. And as a consequence, I am concerned about where it goes in terms of productivity growth. So on Chris's important reflection before, that Xi Jinping is desperately concerned about cracking through the middle income trap because they've had so many Politburo study sessions on this impediment to development globally, and having looked at multiple economic models through which to punch through. My concern is that he may well have landed at the wrong model through which to do it, and then prosecute that enthusiastically. That, I think, is my big caveat about his performance, to go back to your question.
So that's about domestic policy and how Xi's policies may or may not serve the interests of China's population and of growing the economy. Internationally, it was interesting to me, having done some reporting on the Belt and Road Initiative, that it didn't get much of a mention in the communique. This, of course, was Xi's signature initiative enshrined in the Chinese constitution, building out infrastructure around the world, creating a new network of global trade and global power with China at the center. What do you make of the fact that it didn't get much of a mention? Chris?
We don't have the full text yet, so maybe it will be mentioned in there. But I think it is a symptom of something that they are spending a lot of time thinking about, which is this. And it's somewhat related to breaking through the middle income trap. There's a corollary there that I think is, we might call squishier, somewhat related to that, breaking through the middle income trap, but probably deserves its own treatment, which is they're really finding and are very frustrated by the fact that it's really hard to generate international legitimacy without democratization. In other words, you can do all the BRI you want, you can do all the blue hat UN peacekeeping you want, you know, all of these sort of things. There's still a lot of people out there who are critical. And so when I think this has a lot of implications. My own view is that they see that as every bit as existential to their survival as breaking through the middle income trap or not losing Taiwan. I think, you know, it's that high in their hierarchy of need, if you will, and how they think about things. So BRI, I think, you know, specifically, has certainly gone through its ebbs and flows. I mean, it's the classic example in my mind of the leader sets a policy, everybody goes, you know, crazy trying to fulfill the policy. Suddenly there BRIs everything. It's also an opportunity if you're a provincial official and you want to dump that whatever and over to Pakistan, you know, you can do so. And obviously the thing went too crazy and now they're trying to, you know, reboot it in a certain way. But I think it touches on this issue of legitimacy, not just domestic legitimacy, but their ability to be seen legitimate governance system outside of the country. That's how I would frame it.
I think you're correct to raise this question, Mary Kay, because if we were to do a pulse survey of the references to BRI in the public literature over the last couple of years, I would be surprised if we did not find that the intensity of usage has come down by quite some number of notches. Second, my conclusion as to why is simply based on those days in the halcyon past when we used to travel to the Middle Kingdom and actually talk to real life human beings in China about what the hell's going on in their country, as opposed to being isolated in the way in which we now are. The impression I got from my own discussions with your one woman was that from relevant departments was that people begin to scratch their head in Beijing. This is not the public reaction about waste of money. It was in fact finance officials saying, Xi we are not made of money. This is a multi-trillion-dollar initiative, and we've got to fund a military, we've got to do a whole bunch of other stuff, and this is really expensive. I think that has had a material effect on constraining its size, certainly in terms of the traditional physical infrastructure and moving it more in the direction of digital infrastructure, 5G and the rest, and Huawei. Lining up for the future extension of the digital economy, which may turn out to be a more sensible investment long-term as well. But the very final point is going back to Chris's correct reminder of us reserving judgment until we see the full text. I do note, having studied carefully my propaganda department press conference earlier today, that one of the questions did go to the BRI. And the answer delivered by whichever official it was, and I can't remember now, was reeling off a set of data points about the growth in trade to BRI countries, the growth in investment in BRI countries, etc. So they weren't walking away from it. It was part of the orchestrated series of, I think, 6 or 7 questions, which spontaneously combusted from the news conference in Beijing.
So I wanted to circle back to the idea that she and the party should not be criticized. I mean, obviously that can lead to a brittle system if you're not hearing what you need to hear, including the bad news. We're also skating up on a party Congress with no successor in sight, no one being groomed to take over from Xi should something happen and he can't continue to govern. I'm just wondering what each of you think are the inherent risks in both of those things at this moment. Chris?
Yeah, I'll dive in. I think I will caveat by saying I'm increasingly an outlier on all these subjects, because my views don't seem to comport with those of a lot of my analytic colleagues. I'm not concerned about a succession crisis. We'll come back to that in a minute. And I'm not overly concerned about the brittleness, because in my mind, there's a difference between criticism and being able to get the information you need. In other words, this idea that Xi Jinping lives in a bubble, or as someone I think the other day put it, in a cocoon and therefore he doesn't get the information he needs, everyone's lying to him, and so on and so forth. I think if we look at the scope of his tenure, there have been several instances where it was pretty clear that not only did he get the information he needed, but he was willing to soften or change course slightly in various ways. So it's a problem, I think, in terms of the risk of sclerosis, right? I mean, the longer someone is around and, surrounds himself with a coterie of people who wish to highlight his own indispensability for their own needs, that obviously is a problem. And as people age, their ability to be chairman of everything, diminishes. He's overweight, certainly was once a smoker, and has a very stressful job, not usually a recipe for success on the health front necessarily. But on the succession thing, I really want to focus on this, because I think it's a lot like several other areas. As Kevin was highlighting, it's very frustrating not to be able to hop on a plane, get to the country, and talk to people, who you perceive to know things quietly over a tea or a dinner or something like that. We're all looking through the glass even more darkly now. And I think there's a tendency then to just go to these certain memes that don't really make sense, such as there will be an invasion of Taiwan imminently, there will be a succession crisis when Xi Jinping leaves office. I would argue the biggest likelihood of a succession crisis in the party's history was after Mao's death. And they found a way to work it out. Why? In large part because they did the hang together or hang separately, and it's not as if the regime doesn't have procedures, for this. So my sense is they would meet for stability, which is the key. They would very quickly push somebody out front, right? Whether that person would survive as the person out front is another matter. But would it be a bloodbath necessarily? I'm not so sure, because I don't think, to Kevin's point earlier, I don't think there are massive debates about what they should be doing. I don't see anyone, certainly in the Politburo, current Politburo, or any future one, that would say we need to change policy on Xinjiang, we need to change policy on Hong Kong, maybe even the wolf warriorism and so on. So that's my cut on.
I think I have no real disagreement with Chris on the question of political succession, because the system wishes to preserve the system. Therefore the system will innovate at that point, as they have done in previous periods of, let's call it, internal crisis. I think the second point is about, let's call it, bad emperor syndrome. That is, if you're the chairman of everything, and if you're the emperor of everything, unless you're Kangxi General, what if you end up with one of the archetypal bad emperors in Chinese history, whereby bad decisions are replicated across the full breadth of the empire? Look, I think there's a counter narrative to that, which has got some empiricism to it as well. If you were to interview a large number of foreign political leaders and heads of state, foreign ministers, etc., who've sat down for long conversations with Xi Jinping over a long period of time, what is remarkable is, frankly, his intellectual nimbleness, his ability, without notes, to, frankly, range far and wide across an extensive subject matter, to me suggests somebody who's not locked themselves in some cocoon, but in fact has a deeply inquiring mind and proceeds to then terrify his officials by asking all sorts of problematic questions. So I think that is the feature that I have most observed about him. Thirdly, however, at the level of internal political perception within the system, remember in the days of Deng Xiaoping, and Jeremy Barnay, the Australian sinologist, was reminding me of this earlier today when I was chatting with him about the 6th Plenum. Jeremy reminded me that one of the critiques in the period of Deng Xiaoping, just after the death of Mao Zedong and after the Sanzhong Chuanhui in 1978, was we no longer want an Yiyantang, we no longer want a hall of a single voice. And so at a level of political perception, the whole doctrine of collective leadership for 40 years, from 78 on, well, at least 35 years until 2012, was against that problem because we saw where it went, because they saw where it went under Mao. So at a level of political perception right now in the system, I think it is a problem for Xi Jinping politically within, let's call it, party elites, because it's not that he doesn't ask questions, but his predisposition, as Chris and I have discussed before, to then proceed, I won't say as a bull at a gate, but to take a calculated risk, and as Chris has also said, to make a couple of binary calls, for example, on the economy, for example, on China's forward-leaning posture on foreign security policy, against the risks which are knowable and which have been pushed to one side. I think that's what concerns the system, or elements of the system, is his preparedness to make those binary choices. My final point is, where I partly disagree with Chris, which is pretty good, we've been going for an hour, I've only found one thing to disagree with him on, is that I think there are mixed voices within the system about the current direction of economic policy. And frankly, when you look at some of the renditions of common prosperity, some of the renditions of dual circulation economies, some of the renditions of the new development concept, new pattern of development, it does seek to roll back reform. And if you look at some of the public formulations by Xi Jinping, when talking about the new development concept, for example, which is his new economic concept or his new economic framework, he deliberately says, I'm paraphrasing here, some of you folks are going to interpret this the wrong way. Some of you folks are going to say, this is the end of reform and we're back to something which is driven by the state. And the rest of you are going to say, we can't touch the free market, yada, 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 yada. So by virtue of his own analogy, he's pointing to different voices on the economy. I think that is, in fact, a reflection of the reality.
I would just add to that, because I think it's important that not only is that the case, but that Xi himself, and this is to the issue of learnings, is very wise to some of that. So, you recall there was this article on profound transformation or revolution that came out, which was picked up by all the state media and so on and so forth. It's my understanding that Xi Jinping was very displeased with his propagandists that decision was made, in large part because it was this notion of, you're going to scare a lot of people. This is going to sound like another, cultural revolution kicking off. In other words, don't be too hasty in the rollout on common prosperity and so on and so forth. And to Kevin's point earlier, I think that speaks to his political genius. But I think he's right. I mean, I don't disagree that there are other voices, especially on the economic stuff. The question is, how will they articulate that? And do you need the bottom to drop out, on the economy before you could make an effort to change course? And if there was pressure to change course, would Xi Jinping do what Deng and his immediate successors did, which was, when confronted with a choice between political correctness, in terms of Marxist terms, or pragmatic economic choices, they always went with the latter. We've seen a lot of instances so far in his tenure where Xi has chosen the former, even if it cuts his nose to spite his face, or perhaps with common prosperity, cuts his own head off in the terms of what Kevin was highlighting about the private sector.
So we have like 3.5 minutes left. So I'm going to ask a question that we got from our former Asia Society's former executive vice president, Tom Nagorski. And then I have one last question if we have time. So if we could keep answers short, that would be great. The question is, how would either of you counsel President Biden to respond to Xi's invitation to the Beijing Olympic Games? Obviously, enormously important for Xi and for China, equally politically fraught for Biden on the home front. Who wants to take that?
I'll give a quick observation. I would just quote Kevin and I's mutual friend, Bill Bishop, from the Sino System newsletter, who I thought had a very interesting cut on that news article, which was basically, it's either an instance of Xi Jinping getting bad information that Biden could, somehow attend this thing, it'd be very, very difficult, or it's an effort to make Biden look bad, or out of sync with China's, common prosperity for mankind agenda by saying, hey, we invited him, he chose not to come. That's another clear example of U.S. Cold War mentality.
Okay.
I think it's virtually impossible for President Biden to attend. And frankly, the COVID restrictions in China would present their problems even for heads of states and their delegation. And remember, the Chinese would understand that within the system, given Xi Jinping's decision not to attend Glasgow, which I think was primarily driven by COVID realities. Okay.
So my last question, it's said that history is written by the victors, and for now that's Xi, but history is long, and a future Chinese leader may do to Xi what Xi is now doing to his immediate predecessors. What do you think, in 1 minute or less each, what do you think Xi needs to do going forward that it will increase his chances of being remembered kindly by history? Kevin.
Xi Jinping, if his aspiration, which is to make China the most powerful country on earth, will need at some point to recognize that international political legitimacy, as Chris pointed before, will only come off the back of one level or another of political liberalization over time. That has been rejected for all the reasons we're familiar with in the recent internal debate, particularly since 2012-13, explicitly so. But if he's going to be leader through until 2035, if he's going to be leader beyond 2035, and the family genes suggest that he could do that, maybe there's an opportunity for a reappraisal on that question.
And Chris?
Break through the middle income trap.
and how do you rate his chances of being able to do that?
As I said earlier, I think our working assumption should be they're more likely to succeed than to fail based on their past history. And more importantly, and I guess if you're a policymaker, you could say, well, then you could be, quote, pleasantly surprised if they blow it. Is it really a pleasant surprise if they blow it for the rest of us in the global economy and so on? I'm not so sure.
Okay, great. Well, Kevin and Chris, thank you so much. Thanks for everyone who has been listening in. We really appreciate it. And we look forward to you attending more Asia Society events in the future. Have a good
Thank you,
rest of your day or evening.
Thank you for being a kind and generous moderator.
Exactly.
Pleasure. Take care. Bye-bye.